And this is Pastor Lutzer giving the third in a series of lessons entitled Sermon Preparation Made Simpler. Well, we're going to have lots of fun today because I'm going to talk about illustrations, and yes, I'm going to even speak about humor and jokes. Yep, that's what we're going to do. First of all, a couple of comments about illustrations. My key word, by the way, is questions. So the first question we're going to answer is, why do we use illustrations? The answer is, an illustration is something like a window into a building. You may have a good foundation, great walls, wonderful ceiling. But you know, a house without windows is not very inviting. Now, there are some people who just tell only illustrations, one after another. They are building a house without a foundation, without a biblical basis perhaps, and just one illustration after another after another. And I disagree with that because our foundation is God's Word, and illustrations illuminate God's Word. Now, there are some people who don't believe in illustrations. They actually say so. But you know, Jesus made this statement at one point. He said that it says, and without a parable, he did not speak to them. You look at the stories of Jesus. What do you remember right off the bat? Well, you remember his parables, whether it's the Good Samaritan, the story of the prodigal son. Jesus was into story. And that's what good illustrations are. They are stories, and they illuminate the imagination. You can actually see something. And that's why it is so important for us to know about illustrations and to use them well to the glory of God. Another thing is you remember the illustrations. Think of all of the sermons that you have heard, and you forget the context and you forget what was said, but you remember that illustration. Can I just go back a bit into my history? Just for a second. Here I am. I'm a boy, maybe 8 or 9. I don't know how old I was. And I was attending this meeting, this conference. And that was nearly 70 years ago. I have to tell you that when I was born, the Dead Sea was only sick. So that was a long time ago. And there was this evangelist in Canada by the name of Bob Simpson. I remember how he always corrected his glasses like this when he preached. There I'm a little boy sitting there. And he's preaching on the topic of Pilate, who was asked to change what he had written. You know, they said, don't say he is the king of the Jews, but change it to say he said he is king of the Jews. And Bob Simpson was saying, Pilate said, what I have written, I have written. And then he told this story, which I've never used as an illustration. I'm only telling it now to show you how you remember illustrations. He said there was a little boy by the name of Johnny who repeatedly made a grammatical error and said, I have went home. His teacher tried to correct him and it didn't work. So she said to him, I want you to stay after school and I want you to write out 500 times, I have gone home. So Johnny stays after school. He fills page after page writing, I have gone home. He looks up and the teacher's nowhere. So he leaves her a note in which he said, I have completed my assignment. For 500 times I have written, I have gone home. And now I have went home. Well, I don't know exactly what the point of the story was, though I think we could make a point there. But it's the power of story. Now, that's why we should use illustrations. But where do we get them from? Well, we get them from the internet. You ask me, do you read illustration books? Absolutely. Maybe I can only use one out of 10 or 20. But I beg, I borrow, and I steal illustrations. You say, well, is stealing legitimate? Yes, illustrations are not copyrighted. And don't put yourself in the story if it's somebody else's story. That's dishonesty. And don't plagiarize sermons. There was a man who took 8 of my sermons and preached them according to his elders, paragraph by paragraph. And he had other issues of dishonesty, so he actually was fired from his church. Plagiarism is wrong. And don't put yourself in the story, as I've already emphasized, if it's not your story. But I like what Pastor Wiersbe used to say. You milk many cows, but you give your own butter. So here's what you do. You go to the internet, you use illustration books. Church history is rife with great stories and great illustrations of people who have endured hardship and who teach us important lessons. I also believe that when it comes to illustrations, what you and I should do is actually practice saying them. And that's even more important when we get to the humor section, which is really just a few moments away. Let me begin by saying that illustrations have power because, as I mentioned, they put us into the story in ways that are powerful. I'm going to give you a couple of illustrations, and you'll understand how deeply I feel that a good illustration can be transforming. Before I do that, let me tell you, this isn't exactly an illustration, but when I taught preaching up at a cemetery, I should say, north of here, there's a reason why I said cemetery. I actually took the students to the cemetery and taught them how to preach to the dead. You say, oh, really? I said, you're going to be pastors someday. You might as well get used to preaching to the dead. Well, we preached to the dead and they didn't rise. And then we got on our knees and we dedicated ourselves to unrelenting dependence upon God in the proclamation of the gospel. I said, when you ask somebody to be converted and preach the gospel, you're expecting the dead to be raised, the blind to see, and the deaf to hear. How many of those miracles can you do? None. My dear friend, when we preach the gospel, we have to do it in total dependence upon the living God. Years later, I met some of the students and they said, we may have forgotten a lot of what you told us, but we'll never forget the trip to the cemetery from the seminary. I hope I got all that right. Now let me give you some illustrations. There's a message that I frequently preach entitled, How to Survive a Storm. It's the story of Jesus walking on the water. And I preach it often because people are either in a storm, they've either come out of one, or they're going into one. Because all of us have storms. And then, by the way, my key word is lessons. 7 lessons that we learn on how to survive a storm. I tell people, write these down, laminate them, put them on your fridge, because you're going to need them. But then I end with this illustration. You know, Tony Evans, the great African-American preacher who's a friend of mine, he told this story and I verified it with him. He and Lois were on a ship. And it came over the intercom, we're going into a storm. You'd better buckle up. So Lois doesn't like this. She phones the captain, speaks to his assistant, and says, why are we going into the storm? Why don't we just put down anchor and stay here and let the storm blow over and then go? The assistant said, I'll get back to you. So he talks to the captain. The assistant calls back and said, the captain has 2 things to say to you. I'm sure that the first thing was very nicely said. In effect, he diplomatically said, he said, I'm in charge and you're not. But then he said this, and I tell people I want you to write this down. I don't want you to ever forget it. I want you to be able to say this on your deathbed. The captain said, tell that woman that this ship was built with this storm in mind. And my friend, today, when you think of the death of Jesus, his burial, his resurrection, his ascension, that ship came with your storm in mind. And if you trust him, he'll take you all the way to the other side of the lake. Thank you, Tony and Lois, for a great illustration. Let me give you another one. This is actually a legend. You know, sometimes I preach on the judgment seat of Christ. Wrote a book on it, actually. But I like to end with this. You know, there was a man who had a dream that all of his works in life were in this big pile, and then Jesus lit it, and the thing went up in smoke, and you have all these ashes, and he went around with a little tin cup and a little sweeper, a little brush, looking for little bits of gold, silver, and precious stones amid everything that burned. And then I end with this legend. In India, there's a story of a wealthy Raja that was riding along in a beautiful chariot. And there was a beggar who saw him coming and went into the ditch and held out his bowl and wondered if the Raja would actually stop. And he did. The wealthy Raja walked off of his chariot, got off, went to the beggar and said, "Beggar, give me some of your rice." The beggar was angry. "You want some of my rice? You're the wealthy guy and you want some." So gingerly, the beggar gave him 1 grain of rice. The Raja said, "Give me more of your rice." Well, by now the beggar was absolutely enraged. He gave him a 2nd grain of rice. The Raja said, "Beggar, give me more of your rice." Gingerly and in great anger, the beggar gave him 1 more grain of rice and then walked away. The Raja got on his chariot and left. Later on, the beggar looked into his bowl and he noticed that something glittered. He picked it up. It was a grain of gold the size of a grain of rice. He found only 2 more. For every grain of rice, a grain of gold. Jesus is generous. Let's give him our whole bowl of rice. Do you see how an illustration like that can take everything that is said about the judgment seat of Christ, can encapsulate it, and can help people to visualize the importance of gold, silver, and precious stones, and the graciousness of Jesus? Let me give you another one. It happens to be actually also from the Middle East. It's a fable. Now, sometimes I speak on the topic of 1 minute after you die because I've written a book on that topic, and recently I preached on that in Ireland. So this is my opening. In the Middle East, there is a fable about a merchant in Baghdad who sent his servant into the marketplace one morning to run an errand. The servant came back and said, "I rounded a corner and I met Lady Death. And the expression that she had on her face was absolutely scary. I'm scared of Lady Death. Let me take your fastest horse and ride all the way to Samaria tonight to get away from her." So the merchant gave his servant his fastest horse, and off the servant went. Later on that afternoon, the merchant himself went into the marketplace and met Lady Death and said, "Why did you startle my servant?" She said, "I didn't intend to." But she said, "I'm the one that was startled. I couldn't believe that he was in a marketplace here in Baghdad when I have an appointment with him in Samaria tonight." The statistics on death are very impressive, aren't they? No matter what you do, you can never get away from your appointment. So I use that as a beginning. Now, there are plenty of illustrations in between. May I give you one personal illustration? By the way, speaking of personal illustrations, don't make yourself the hero of the story. If you do that once in every 2 years. If anything, tell us about your struggles and how you overcame them. But let me give you a personal illustration of when I was in Washington, D.C., when the first George Bush was president, long before 9/11. And then we'll get to some jokes, by the way, they're coming up here. And here I'm preaching in this church in Virginia, and when I'm finished preaching, a Secret Service agent comes to me and said, I'm with the Secret Service. I'm part of the president's detail. Would you like to come into the White House and be in the Oval Office tomorrow? Well, I was with my daughter. Rebecca wasn't able to come with me that weekend, and I didn't have to pray about that. Absolutely, tell me when. 10 o'clock, meet me outside of the White House. So we meet there, and we're going through all of these Secret Service agents who are all in those little houses that you see at the White House, and they look at us, and then they look at the Secret Service agent, and they just wave us through. You get to the door of the White House, and there are more agents, and they just looked at us, and you're with him? Just go on in. Now, before you get into the Oval Office, there's actually a guard standing there, almost motionless, standing at attention. He looks at us, turns his head slightly, looks at the agent, motions. You can go in. Now, we couldn't go to the president's desk, but we were in the Oval Office. I've not used this illustration in 10 or 15 years, but when I did use it, this is the way in which I applied it. Let's suppose that all of us die together in some catastrophe, and now we're on the other side, and Jesus meets us to take us to the heavenly city. And I can just imagine that along the way, use your imagination here, there are centuries of angels. And the angels see us coming. They look at us, and then they look at Jesus, and they say, you're with him? Go on in. When we see the glory of God, we have a flashback, and we remember all of our terrible sins. And we begin to think of who we really are, and we say to ourselves, I can't go in. I can't go in. But the angel says to us, you're with him. Go on in. Then Jesus presents us to the Father and says, Father, these are the redeemed, and I have investigated them, and I find no fault in them. Clothed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. You can only get there when you're with him. Now, I know I turn to the subject of humor. And I need to say that sometimes it is misused. I remember listening to a man who was preaching, and I was convicted. It was powerful. And in the middle of it, he told a funny story, got us mentally totally off in another direction. And it just all dissipated the impact of his message. And you know, there have been times when I've done the same thing because I have so many different stories and quips and so forth that I've encountered throughout the years. And I'm actually looking now for something I want to read to you. And so it can be misused. But when I'm out speaking, I especially like to use humor at the beginning of the sermon. And in that way, then, people relate. It relaxes them. It lets them know that I'm a human being. And it gives a sense of connection. I think that there's a reason why God created people so that they could laugh. Now, God laughs, but he laughs at the wicked, according to Psalm 2. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. Of course, that's metaphorical. But you and I have the capacity and the ability to laugh. And it's fun to laugh at ourselves. Here I am, I'm speaking to a group of pastors, Baptists. And I was once a Baptist pastor. So I have every right to begin my sermon this way. Once I was in San Francisco walking across the Golden Gate Bridge. When I saw this guy on the bridge about to jump, I asked him to be detained so that I could put film in my camera. And I said, don't jump. He turned his head and said, nobody loves me. I said, God loves you. How do you know there's a God? He said. Of course there's a God. He said, I guess you're right. And a tear came to his eye. I said, are you a Christian, a Jew, or a Hindu, or what? He said, a Christian. I said, small world, me too, Protestant, Catholic, or Greek Orthodox? He said, Protestant. I said, me too, what franchise? He said, Baptist. I said, me too, Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist? He said, Northern Baptist. I said, me too, Northern Conservative Baptist or Northern Liberal Baptist? He said, Northern Conservative Baptist. I said, me too, Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist or Northern Conservative Reform Baptist? He said, Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist. I said, me too, Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist, Great Lakes region, or Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist, Eastern region? He said, Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist, Great Lakes region. I said, me too, Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist, Great Lakes region, Council of 1879, or Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist, Great Lakes region, Council of 1912. He said, Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist, Great Lakes region, Council of 1912. And I screamed, die, heretic, and I pushed him over. What a way to begin talking about Baptists so that they get a chance to actually laugh at themselves. And so what we can do is we can use humor. I mean, if you're speaking at a marriage conference or speaking on marriage, just think of all the humor that there is out there that is perfectly clean and legitimate. First of all, remember what marriage is. Marriage is two people solving problems together that they'd have never had if only they'd remained single. So with that, you can understand. You might just have a quip like, I know a guy who was married by a judge. Now he wished he'd asked for a jury. Or a story that I like to tell about a man and a woman that were out celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. Each was 60 years old. An angel came to them and said, what would you like for your anniversary? The wife said, I've never traveled. The angel flashed his sword, and in her hand were 2 tickets for a world cruise. It was the man's turn. He took the angel aside and said, I'd really like to be married to somebody who is 30 years younger than I am. The angel flashed his sword, and instantly the man was 90 years old. Be very specific when you ask God for something. Now, I also have to say that if humor is not your thing, don't try to tell these stories, because sometimes it's voice inflection, sometimes it's pauses. All of it contributes, but something told well helps people to open up to you. And so I happen to believe in it. Now, if you can have an illustration, and I could go on and on and on about this, but I'm going to end it very quickly by saying if you could have an illustration of humor that fits directly in the sermon, that's pure gold. I preached a sermon on the eternality of God. From everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. And the text says that to God 1,000 years is as a day, and a day as 1,000 years. And so I told the story of a man who was talking to God and said, God, what is 1,000,000 years to you? God said, about a second. He said, God, he said, Lord, how much is $1,000,000 to you? God said, about a penny. Lord, he said, could I have a penny? And the Lord said, sure. Just a second. Let me tell you one more bit of humor. I was preaching in Texas this past summer, and Texans kind of have a bit of an edge, and I love Texans. I hope many of you who are watching this are from Texas. My wife was born in Dallas and was raised in Texas. So I love you Texans, but there was a Texan who was crossing the border from the United States into Canada, and the customs official said to him, do you have any guns? The Texan said, sure, what do you need? But there's another story I told when I was speaking in Texas, and here it is. There was a guy from the DEA, that's the Drug Enforcement Agency. He came to a Texas farmer and said, "I'm here to inspect your farm because we think that you might be growing marijuana here." The farmer said, "Oh, you can go anywhere you like on this farm. You can check it out. But you see that field over there, just behind those trees? Don't go there, but you can go anywhere else." The official whipped out his badge and shoved it in the farmer's face and said, "Look at this, the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency. I have the entire power of the United States government behind me. I can go wherever I like." The farmer said, "Oh, okay." So, of course, as you might guess, the official went into that field first. A few moments later, the farmer hears this shriek, and this official is running and shrieking, and a great big bull is coming across the field, about to gore the official. And the farmer shouts, "Show him your badge! Show him your badge!" The Texans liked it. Sometimes we have authority, and sometimes we don't. Well, I hope that this has inspired you to use illustrations. If used well, you can use humor. Learn to tell these stories well, and I think it'll help you to connect with people. And now I want to end with Francis of Assisi. There is a story about a beggar saying to him, "Art thou Saint Francis?" He said, "Yes." And then the beggar said this, "Take heed that thou be as good as men believe thee to be." Our people in our congregation actually do believe we're good. They think that we walk in the Spirit all the time. They hold us in high regard, maybe higher regard than they should hold us. May it always be said of us as pastors. Oh, I wish that this were said of all of us. We are as good as our people believe us to be. We have an awesome privilege to preach God's holy word. Let's do it with clarity, with power, with illustrations, with a sense of conviction and passion, because eternity is at stake. God bless you, and you have a good day all day.